Hello YouTube, I'm Nix. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to cover a story by one of my favorite, Will Rain. The story is called Let Me In. It's a longer story, so I will be splitting it into two parts. And let's begin. When I was 10 years old, I heard a man die and did nothing to help. It's not something I'm proud of, but I was just a scared kid at the time. My parents often left me alone at home when I was a child. I won't say they didn't love me or anything so dramatic, but they had priorities. Oftentimes, I was not especially high on that list. Still, I enjoyed the solitude. I had the run of the house. I could pretty much get away with whatever I wanted while they were gone. Well, as long as I made sure to clean up after myself. What they didn't know couldn't hurt me, after all. It was early February when it happened, while my folks were out on their part Valentine's, part anniversary date. They had married around that time of year, about a decade and a half before that day, so they would make a big deal about it annually. It was snowy outside, and I wanted to go play in it while they were gone, but I had the biggest fear of inadvertently getting myself locked out of the house and freezing to death before anyone could arrive in time to save me. It was nearing 10 o'clock when my mom called to tell me they would not be home until morning. This would be neither my first nor last night alone in the house, so I assured her I would keep the doors locked and get to bed at a reasonable hour. Of course, what I considered reasonable and what she did were quite different. Was I being responsible? I would have likely already been in my bedroom, but I was happily in the middle of binging horror movies downstairs when she called. I won't say they never gave me nightmares as my mother warned, but I still loved them. We had a great assortment of channels on our unlocked cable box, so it wasn't hard to track down movies to suit my late night tastes. It was growing closer to midnight by the time I felt my body begin to crave my bed while the commotion began outside. As I peeked through the living room window to see a man screaming while running across the street, my imagination combined with the movie I was watching to create a whole manner of curiosities as to what could be going on. He was screaming out for anyone to help him. The poor guy sounded both horrified and desperate while he ran to some of the neighboring houses, pounding on their doors. "Help! For God's sake, somebody help me!" He cried out into the night as he slammed his fists against the doors and walls. Most houses just turned their lights off when all of this began, but I couldn't look away. What had gotten this guy so worked up? I wondered to myself. I was an overly imaginative child as it was, so this terrified stranger inspired an array of wild theories to pen across the forefront of my mind. Everything from some sort of bloodthirsty serial killer to the devil himself pursuing from a distance flashed across my subconscious while he begged for help. It was a typical suburban street I lived on as a kid, not indifferent to thousands across the country. Little to nothing ever happened there, aside from the occasional car pulled over for one reason or another. Perhaps one disgruntled neighbor yelling at another for something completely pointless, but nothing especially exciting or noteworthy. Finally, the man arrived at my door. He beat his hands against the wood while shouting at the top of his lungs, begging me to help. I was just a kid. What the hell was I supposed to do? "Please help me! They're coming!" he yelled out from the other side of the front door. "Let me in! For God's sake, help me!" My curiosity getting the better of me, I dragged a chair up to the door, climbing upon it to look through the peephole. The man looked young. He was maybe in his early 20s, though to my perception at the time, he may as well have been nearing his 50s. He had dark beard stubble and wore a thick blue hoodie, a knit cap, and gloves. It was really cold outside, so I knew he had to be freezing. "Please, just let me in," he whimpered softly. His voice quivered in a manner that would suggest he was possibly fighting to hold back tears. "Just help me. Please, I'm begging you." I felt bad for the guy, but I couldn't invite a stranger into the house, even if I did believe he was truly scared. I wasn't so much as allowed to have friends over while my folks were gone, let alone some adult I never laid eyes on before. "I can't help you, mister," I called out to him. I hoped he would just move on to the next house after hearing that I was only a child, but it just made him beg harder. "Please, kid. I swear to Christ I won't hurt you. I just need to get off the street. My dad says I can't have people over. I'm really sorry, but just let me in. Please." "I'm sorry, mister. I just can't. My folks would kill me." Suddenly, the man whipped his body around, pressing his back to the door. With his head right against the peephole, I had no idea what was going on. "Oh God," he almost whispered from the other side of the door. I jumped down from the chair to run to the living room window again. By the time I made it to the glass, the man started screaming out again, wailing words that no longer sounded legible in any way. He was frantically pounding on the door even harder than before. I heard the knob jiggle as he attempted to force his way in, but I had it locked and deadbolted, just as my mother told me. "Jesus Christ! Just let me in! For God's sake, please!" As I glared out the window, I saw 3 dark shapes speeding across the road in front of my eyes. They were almost blurry, as though I were viewing them through an unfocused camera lens. I couldn't even make out what they were, but they darted off the road and towards my house so quickly that my eyes could barely register it. Whatever they were, I was terrified the second they sped in the direction of my home. I whipped the curtains closed before planting myself down on the floor beneath the window with my back pressed to the drywall. My whole body was shivering almost uncontrollably, as I just knew they would break right through the simple wooden door. Suddenly, the man's yells changed again, this time to blood-curdling squeals that caused the hair on the back of my neck to spring up, while making my stomach churn to the point I thought I may spew what remained of the reheated pizza I had for dinner across the carpet I sat upon. I heard more violent pounding against the door as well as the walls of the house, accompanied by a sound that reminded me of when my dad would cut turkey at Thanksgiving. The yells turned to gargles and whines, followed by something wet spraying across the ground and the siding of my home. I heard snapping, cracking, and crunching, along with something like fabric being torn. There was another sound else as well, one that I wouldn't allow my youthful ears to accept at the time. I tried to force the sounds of large jaws chewing on the meat and bone into the back of my mind at the time, but they still lingered on the edge of my subconscious. After the man's moist and bubbling screams faded, there was a chorus of shrill squeals that did not resemble anything I ever heard before. It reminded me of when I would pinch the mouth of a balloon while letting the air out, only much louder and far more guttural. Those sounds alone almost forced me to lose control of my bladder, while I felt my head grow dizzy from the blood draining down to where my guts churned. After some time, everything fell silent again, but I would not pick myself up from the floor until some time later. When I finally did emerge from the safe spot under the window, I ran up the stairs to my bedroom, locked the door and hid under my blanket until I eventually passed out. Of course, even sleep wouldn't free my mind from what I had heard. It only amplified those events in my disturbing dreams, exaggerating every rip and tear my young ears had heard that night. I was awakened the next morning by the sound of police sirens out front, accompanied by a series of loud knocks on the front door. I hesitantly peeked through my bedroom window to see several police cars and a black SUV parked on the road in front of my house. I was too scared to answer the door since my folks had not arrived back home yet. Not only was I not prepared to face whatever remained of the stranger, but I was almost worried the authorities would somehow hold me responsible for what happened. I just stayed up in my room doing my best to remain silent, attempting to ignore the hammering on the front door. After a while, the knocking stopped, but the police stayed out there until my parents drove up an hour or so later. I heard the muffled voices of my mom and dad frantically talking back and forth with the police before my mom came bursting through the front door and up the stairs. She tried to get in, but my door was still locked. She just pounded on the wood while yelling for me to let her in. Her words, along with the knocking, sent a shiver up my spine after the previous night's events. I pulled myself from under the safety of my blanket to grant her entry, but as soon as our eyes met, she wrapped her arms around me and pulled me close. After a few minutes of just holding me in place, she started grabbing my arms, running her hands across my face, seemingly checking for injuries. Once she was certain I was alright, she asked me if I knew what happened or if I heard anything during the night. I'm not entirely sure why I lied to her, claiming that I was asleep and didn't hear anything. Maybe I felt guilty about what I assumed had happened to the terrified man who begged for help. It could have just been as simple as I didn't want my folks to know I stayed up so late. Either way, I played dumb and will continue to tell the same story to anyone else who asked over the following weeks. Sometime later, my father came inside after the swarm of vehicles in our street thinned out. One of the police cars and the black SUV stayed out the front for a bit, while two officers, accompanied by some guys in suits, walked the neighborhood. They went to each house, presumably seeking out anyone who might have witnessed the seemingly gruesome attack. It had been a bizarre and unsettling night and day, but I paid it no mind after a few weeks passed. Sure, kids at my school spun many a rumor about the murder that had apparently occurred on my street, though a body was never found, only a white puddle of blood that spread across the front lawn and a driveway, as well as a splatter on the walls and the door. Some would theorize it was way more than the human body was capable of holding, but there were a lot of exaggerated tales over that first week. For several months after the man begged to be allowed entry into my home, my parents refused to leave me alone in the house. It was quite nice if I'm being honest. Though I missed having the run of the place a bit, my folks were more attentive than they ever been. Yes, I would have to accompany them on plenty of errands that were not to my liking, but they could often twist their arms to buy me something while we were out. As I said before, I would never accuse them of being particularly neglectful. They just never saw the danger in leaving the house with me as its only occupant until then. Of course, their new outlook didn't last for long. As time passed, they grew more comfortable that there was indeed nothing to fear. That what happened was a one-time thing, perhaps some sort of freak accident that only occurs once in a lifetime. It was mid-December before I would be left alone again. My parents had a Christmas party to attend with some friends, so they asked if I would be okay on my own. Given the fact I had no desire to be left with some babysitter who was likely only to be a few years older than me, I said I would be fine. Honestly, though I enjoyed them being more attentive over those months, I did miss my solitude. As was usually the case, my mom checked in around 10ish, to which I informed her all was well. She told me they would likely be home around 1 and recommended that I try to get to bed soon. Of course, I had no intention of hitting the sack until I saw the lights of my parents' Honda rolling into the driveway, but she didn't need to know that. After successfully riding my makeshift Captain America shield down the stairs several times in a row, I decided to just hunt for a good R-rated movie to bide my time until I would have to head up to my bedroom. It was creeping up on midnight when the knocking on the front door pulled my attention away from Jason, lazily strolling after a fleeing, topless girl. "Let me in," the voice called from outside. I was stunned. My whole body instantly tensed up as my mind revisited the stranger who was left as nothing more than a bloody pool across the front lawn. My father had ended up having to repaint the front of the house as the stains would not wash off. Even the concrete driveway still wore a few marks that would not clean up. And that's it for part 1. Tune in to part 2 to know how the story ends. Thank you very much for watching and goodbye.